Part 2 of our evolution videos deals with the modern synthesis. This is the idea that natural selection is the major mechanism of evolution. So we talked in the previous video about the book On the Origin of Species, and one of the things that's important to know is that for about 70 years after the publication of that book, Darwin's ideas were still not widely accepted. Lamarck's shadow and his ideas really seemed to loom over Darwin. Most biologists, they agreed about the reality of evolution, the idea that living species shared a common ancestor and are transformed over time, but this idea of natural selection being the major engine of evolution was still controversial. Many biologists felt that there must be some sort of built-in direction to the variation that arose in each generation, which would help push the lineage towards its current state. And remember, this is based on Lamarck's ideas that if a giraffe had to stretch its neck longer and longer to reach the leaves of the tree in order to eat, that the next generation would be born with a longer neck. However, in the 1920s, geneticists really began to recognize that natural selection could indeed act on genes. It became clear that any given trait was usually the product of many genes rather than one, and if there was some type of mutation to these genes, that could cause a small change into the trait rather than a drastic transformation. And there were several scientists that really helped set this foundation. One of them was named Ronald Fisher, and these guys carried out breeding experiments and also worked on building a mathematical model of evolution. Fisher and his colleagues really helped to set Darwin's concept of natural selection on a new foundation based in genetics. And this is the idea of the modern synthesis. You have Darwin's ideas, but then the new genetic ideas that are built into it. The real answer and the real idea of the modern synthesis really didn't come out until about the 1930s, thanks to a Soviet-born geneticist, and oh my goodness, I watched YouTube videos on how to pronounce his name and I've forgotten, but it's Dobozansky or something somewhat similar to that. Okay, so one thing just as a quick note, there are a couple of different ideas of evolution. You have microevolution, which happens on a small scale, and macroevolution, when this is a scale that would transcend the boundaries of a single species. They both rely on the same mechanisms, that is mutation, migration, genetic drift, and natural selection. Microevolution is just a change in gene frequency within a population, and that's really what we're focusing on here. Evolution at that scale can be observed over a short period of times, for example, between one generation and another. A good example of this is looking at the genes for pesticide resistance within a population of crop pests. That would be considered microevolution. Macroevolution generally refers to evolution at a species level. So instead of focusing on an individual beetle, macroevolution would require you to look at an entire group of beetles and its position on a phylogenetic tree. So I said in the beginning that this was the idea of the modern synthesis, and that the modern synthesis really connects Charles Darwin and his ideas on evolution to genetics. And that scientist Dobozansky, oh goodness, I totally messed it up. He's really the key founder in this, and he had a few ideas, and I'm not going to go over them all, but one of them is that evolutionary phenomena can be explained in a way consistent with known genetic mechanisms and the observation of naturalists. So now we're really, because Darwin was a naturalist, so we're putting those two ideas together. He also said that evolution is gradual. There are small genetic changes that are regulated by natural selection, and these changes can accumulate over long periods of time. Discontinuities among species are explained as originating gradually through geographic separation and extinction. He also said that natural selection is by far the main mechanism of change. Even slight advantages are important when continued, and the object of selection of the phenotype in its surrounding environment. So this little part is a total review, but just to sort of keep this in context, we had originally talked about Darwin and all of his observations, and then the modern synthesis really connects this part of it, the idea of where traits come from. You've got DNA, and DNA is transcribed into RNA, which is then translated into protein, and that will ultimately lead to a trait. So we're talking about the genetics. Also, that variation is going to come from a mutation. A mutation is a change in the DNA sequence. This is something that happens spontaneously and is not avoidable. Mutations will create alleles. These are different versions of genes for any specific trait. So you can have an allele for eye color, and that can be brown or blue. The gene itself is still eye color, you just have different versions of that gene. The definition of evolution is changes in allele frequency over time. So Darwin's idea, descent with modification, this definition really encompasses small-scale evolution, being changes in gene frequency from one population to the next. That would be microevolution, and also large-scale evolution, which is the descent of different species from a common ancestor over many generations. So just to look at this example picture here, changes in allele frequency over time, you have an initial population that has the same amount of each of the different colors. You've got blue, yellow, green, etc. And the frequency distribution of each one of those colors is the same. And then if we were to go over and look at the fifth generation, you would see that that frequency distribution has changed, and then go down to the 10th generation, and that frequency has changed even more. So evolution would be changes in the allele frequency over time. One example of this that's kind of a classic example is the Galapagos finches. So two scientists, Grant and Grant, studied the finch population on an isolated island in the Galapagos Islands, and they measured the beak dimensions of all the birds on the island every year for decades. And they were able to connect the change in beak dimensions to fluctuations in the environment. So for example, precipitation and seed sizes. So the beak shape would fit what was happening in the environment. One thing that's important to note as far as misconceptions go is that evolution is not a population level phenomenon, meaning you're not going to have an individual that is evolving. The evolution of a population will emerge from individual fitness of members of that population, meaning some sort of mutation that makes an individual more likely to survive in a given environment would thus be selected for when that individual is more likely to produce offspring. If they survive and reproduce or not, the frequency of the alleles in the next generation will change accordingly. So the allele frequency between one generation is set. Evolution would happen when the allele frequency changes across generations. And that does it for part 2.